Welcome everybody, Garry Adelman, Chief Historian, American Battlefield Trust. This video is for you, the members of the American Battlefield Trust who have helped save so many battlefields, and as you can probably see behind me, we are at Cedar Mountain. For those of you who don't get to come here, or you've been here and you want to see it again, or you want a new interpretation of it, here we are. This video is for you. So, we are talking about a battle that took place in August of 1862, and before the American Battlefield Trust and its members and our good friends here, the Friends of Cedar Mountain Battlefield, really got active, there was nothing really preserved here. All you could see were some of these signs that you can see behind me. I'll walk you over here to this Douglas Southall Freeman marker. Of course, he was a gentleman Virginia historian, wrote Lee's Lieutenants, wrote Robert E. Lee in 4 volumes, both masterpieces, and he wanted to make sure these places were remembered. So he put up these all around Virginia, dozens of them, and sometimes they end up in out-of-the-way places where they're in somebody's neighborhood now. It wasn't a neighborhood when he put them up. This, in a way, was early preservation, early battlefield preservation, and in part, it might have helped to spur battlefield preservation. Indeed, it would help people to remember what battles were fought where. Now, we're talking about August of 1862, but we need to go back a little bit because in the winter and spring of 1862, George Brinton McClellan will float his army down from around Washington toward Fort Monroe. That will result in the Peninsula Campaign, where his army is going to move generally westward, and there will be, of course, fighting at siege at Yorktown, fighting at Lee's Mill, a brutal battle at Williamsburg, culminating in the Battle of Fair Oaks or Seven Pines. That puts the Confederate commander, Joseph E. Johnston, out of the fight, and that elevates Robert E. Lee and puts him into the fight, okay? Robert E. Lee immediately strikes back. You know the story. That's the 7 days battles in which he's going to push George McClellan away from Richmond further and further until McClellan is actually backed up against the James River. Being not especially concerned about George McClellan, Robert E. Lee wants to strike out toward and maybe even into the north while also threatening the other Union Army, the one that was left behind to guard Washington, D.C. The one among them, the troops that George McClellan thought should have been with him on the peninsula and would have helped lead him to victory, but of course you know, Abraham Lincoln said it himself. Sending troops to George McClellan, to General McClellan, is like shoving fleas across the barn. Not enough of them seem to get there. So Robert E. Lee wants to come and bring his whole force to bear upon this other force guarding Washington under General John Pope. Pope is not liked. He's not much liked in the army. He famously, of course, said his headquarters would be in the saddle, to which people retorted, of course, I think he has his headquarters where his hindquarters are supposed to be. He later issued incendiary orders so that the people of Virginia did not like him at all, and in fact, Robert E. Lee even used a bad word about him, calling him that miscreant Pope, and that is not something Lee did for all of his opponents, so he was not liking him. In any case, Lee was going to take overwhelming force and fall upon Pope's army before McClellan could reinforce him, and this is in early August of 1862. Lee leaves McClellan down outside Richmond and starts to march north with Stonewall Jackson in the van. Jackson seizes a town near here called Gordonsville, or he's in the vicinity, and John Pope is going to move forward himself to try to seize Gordonsville, and that's going to bring elements, not Lee's whole army, not Pope's whole army, but elements of his army into conflict here at Cedar Mountain. We're talking about 16,000 Confederates under General Thomas Stonewall Jackson against Nathaniel Banks. They'd met before. It didn't go well for Banks. Here they are going to meet again. We'll see who you put your money with. But let me give you a little orientation of what we're talking about here, because we're standing at the battlefield's most 2 significant things. You can see them. The first one right behind me, this is called the Crittenton Gate. It's also simply known as the Gate. So famous it was. This is where Confederates were pouring through along a lane, the Crittenton Lane, and which happens to point directly to Cedar Mountain. And you can see the lower slopes of Cedar Mountain over there, and the very slopes that you can see there are actually going to serve as an artillery position for the Confederate Army. In other words, the Confederate Army will show up at this battlefield arrayed generally like this, and the Union Army is going to be arrayed opposite, facing this way. So in short, the Confederates are going to show up, not with their whole force, namely without A.P. Hill's 6 brigades, his whole division, and the Confederates will end up aligning in this general fashion. That's a simplification of it, and the Union will be across these fields coming generally toward us. So let's walk a little bit further, because as we walk here, we are on the Old Culpeper Road. Yeah, the road isn't the nice roads you see in the distance, nor Route 15, where you might see cars and trucks going right now, but rather this. This is the road that is going to go all the way to Culpeper, and it was here during the battle, and it sort of formed an avenue of advance for both sides if they wanted to use it here. So, August 9th, 1862, up comes elements of Stonewall Jackson's army, and up comes elements of Nathaniel Banks's army. And they start clashing, and the incredible thing is Stonewall's here with more troops, but who attacks first? The Union attacks. Banks launches attacks against Jackson, and much to everybody's surprise, even though he has his old Stonewall Brigade with him, it is the Confederates who start to buckle. The Union is winning this battle at this point. During this time, there's a Confederate general, brigadier general named Charles Winder. Looks like Winder, but it's Winder. And Winder comes on the field. He'd been sick for a while, and he comes on the field, and people are urging him not to go into the fight. And he says, no, his blood is up. Stonewall Jackson later said that he was stirred by the ardent patriotism, and that brought him into the battle. It was an astoundingly hot day. We're talking about 96, 98 degrees, and they didn't even have a real field back then. So we're talking about a very hot day. The Union soldiers, a guy from Wisconsin, talked about the sun blistering their faces until it looked like they were wearing masks of mustard of some sort. Mustard plaster, I think they said. So it was a very uncomfortable situation that Winder comes into, and Winder wanted to come up to where the Confederate batteries were. Loved the artillery, and he comes up on horseback right to this rise that you see right up here. So there were Confederate guns up here, and Winder comes walking up or riding up, and in the bombardment that sort of preceded and continued through the battle, Winder will have a shell go through his side. It rips into him right here, and he is brought to a nearby building, probably a schoolhouse, probably one that was photographed later at least twice. And there General Winder will die. A severe loss to the Confederacy. He was seen as a good combat commander, but on the fight goes. The Union continues to get, make some good gains. Over in these woods right here, I believe it's some of Crawford's and some of the other troops are going to push into the Confederate line. The Stonewall Brigade breaks for the first time, and up comes Stonewall Jackson himself. The brigade is named after him, and he is concerned, and he needs to rally them. That's not something he needed to do much, but he goes to pull his sword out of the scabbard. Famously, Stonewall Jackson never pulled his sword, and he didn't this day either because it was rusted to the scabbard. He couldn't get it out. He detaches the whole thing and brings up sword and scabbard together and says, "Your general is with you. Will you rally? Will you follow me?" And they do. He inspires his troops, and it was none too soon. The Union was about to break through. Yes, Stonewall Jackson was about to lose to Nathaniel P. Banks. I mean, handily too. But right at that moment, right as things, and I'm simplifying things, but right as things weren't going well for the Confederates, up comes A.P. Hill and his six brigades in his division, and that's going to help anybody. This is one of the best divisions in the Army of Northern Virginia. They had fought a lot of the 7 days battle, and let me just lay things out at this point now, because now the Union outnumbered now 2-to-1 with the arrival of A.P. Hill. We're talking about 16,000 Confederates along this line where the camera is, and about 8,000 Union soldiers here. And not only that, the Yankees are sort of in a line like that, but if you'll focus over here, the Confederates are able to place some artillery on that shelf over there, which is going to menace the Union left flank the whole time. So you see the Union is in a way surrounded by a right angle of Confederates. You've got artillery up here on the mountain, and you've got Confederate troops over here, and the Yankees are over here. It's going to be hard for them to make much gains. The arrival of A.P. Hill and Jackson's big movement is going to allow the Confederates enough time and the strength they need to really win this battle. Let's have a few seconds of Zen as we walk up to this tree here. We'll get back to the battle in a moment, but for now, all the land we're walking on is preserved by the American Battlefield Trust, and it is stewarded by us along with our friends, the Friends of Cedar Mountain Battlefield. We own everything off in this direction as well, which was probably a wheat field at the time. We'll talk about that, maybe a cornfield over there, and we own everything that you can see off in this area as well. If you walk this battlefield, you might be able to catch some of our silhouettes that we have, Union and Confederate soldiers, as well as artillery pieces to kind of denote it as a battlefield. We'd love to hear from you as to what other features do you think you want to see on battlefields. Do you want to see more trails, more signs? Do you want to see more of these silhouettes? Do you want to see telescopes, art stations? Should we involve something else, augmented reality? But also we own everything here, not only to Route 15 where you might see the occasional car, but another 50 to 100 acres off in that direction, and a substantial set of acreage outside of the view past the farm buildings over there that we are able to secure under easements. this is a well-preserved battlefield. There's a few pieces that we would need to still complete it, but the battle rages on. After the Confederates got Hill's reinforcements, it's really no question the Union should get out of there. The Southerners push heavy on them. The Union begins to fall back toward Culpeper, and there's going to be a running fight because the Confederates are going to pursue them, set up guns again, pursue them more, and it is a terrible defeat for the Union. We're talking about 3,700 casualties in the battle, I think about equally distributed as I remember, but the Confederates avoided a narrowly avoided a terrible defeat under an enemy that they should have been able to and had handily beat before. Now, here we are in the shade of a tree. It's not a witness tree, but it's a good place to stop. But I'd like to point over to this memorial over here. It's really not a memorial so much as it is a marker. And if I look at this one, I didn't pre-look at this one, but it looks like it says number 6, and it says, oh, of course I'm having trouble reading this one now, but what I want to point out is that there are more than 50 of these things were placed in about 1906 by a local judge, a guy named Grimsley, Civil War veteran, and he came out and had a map and a key to these particular one. Oh, I'm sorry, I can now read it. It says Pogue's Battery. I couldn't read it before, so it says Pogue's Battery. So this is the battery behind which Winder was when he was actually mortally wounded or basically killed when the shell ripped into his side. So we can use these markers and use the key that Judge Grimsley left behind for us. Some of those markers were moved by farmers long before the trust came involved or anything like that, but we still have his map, so we can see at least what his positions were. There's a lot written about this battle. We have the official records, and we have all sorts of things written about this battle. We also have photographic documentation. So there's a pretty extensive series of photos taken here. Let's say it's about 14 or 15 photos. That might not seem like a lot, but most battlefields don't even have photographs taken within the year of that particular battle. So there is a photo famously taken that actually shows the area around the gate. But as we get up here, I want to give you another view to talk about a couple of the other photos that you may have seen before. The most famous of which is Union soldiers. We know that they are Maine soldiers standing among fresh graves on a battlefield. That is, by the way, new. Until 1862, there were no photojournalists following armies around, and only in 1862 did they start to get a field hospital with fresh wounded, fresh graves on a battlefield. And here at Cedar Mountain, they actually secured for the first time dead horses on an American battlefield. And of course, it would only be about another 5 or 6 weeks until photographers achieved their ultimate coup for a photojournalist at least, and that is human carnage on a battlefield. People had written about it for centuries, if not millennia. Finally, you could see this terrible depiction of war, and we came close here by Union photographer, Northern photographer Timothy O'Sullivan, working for Matthew Brady at that time, securing photos of this battlefield. So about that famous photo, before I sort of digress there, it is taken actually about 150, 200 yards down off in that direction, but if you'll focus this way, it looks right at Cedar Mountain, and the graves are right next to the road right here, and you can see the soldiers standing sort of right behind me, although again 150 yards further over. We don't need to go over that far. I'll say that there are a few little knobs on the right of the mountain. Do you see how there's the mountain there, and then there are a couple of sort of knobs? Those are actually other hills that appear off in that direction. That's the key to getting the proper angle. You have to stand at the right trajectory to get that to line up just perfectly. We'll try to throw that photo up for you if we're able. Now, what I find interesting is that we can look off in that direction, and in that photograph, off across what is now Route 15, there are 2 trees in a particular configuration. Just by chance, photographer O'Sullivan was over at those trees as well, and he took a picture back over toward us. And that's how you can see that this back here, if you can focus in on, looks exactly like the wheat field that I was talking about. People argue about whether that wheat field went further over this way or if it was just over that way, but we actually have that rarest of all Civil War things, photos looking in different directions toward each other, and that helps us sort of set up what I like to call sort of 19th century virtual reality. We can start to get a feeling for the space around here. There are other photos right around here behind me of some of those same Maine soldiers standing among the dead horses on the battlefield, so it's well documented that way. We had Judge Grimsley come and mark the battlefield, and then you, the members of the trust, and we and our friends at the Friends of Cedar Mountain Battlefield came along, and we've been able to make an actual battlefield here. It won't be long before we send you something in the mail for another effort here. I don't have anything in mind in particular, but I hope that we do. So this is not the biggest battle. Like I said, 3,600, 3,700 casualties. But remember, just a year and a half earlier, that would have been the bloodiest battle ever fought in American history. So we should remember that if you're talking about 3,700 people, they're all people. They're individuals just like you and I. I know many of you have ancestors in the Civil War. Probably some of you have ancestors in this particular battle. So what you're doing is important, and I hope you enjoyed our little spin around Cedar Mountain. Thank you for supporting battlefield preservation, and maybe the cameraman, that's Andy Poulton behind the camera, could swing over to the mountain and close it out. Oh, I forgot! One more thing, so these cannons right behind us, you also helped with those. These cannons used to sit out in front of Lee's headquarters at Gettysburg. The park didn't need them. They weren't the types of cannons they needed right there on the first day, and we quickly decided to work with our friends here at Cedar Mountain, and they raised the money to bring the cannons down here. And now we have 2 Parrott rifles. These are reproduction Parrott rifles, but Parrott rifles nonetheless here adorning the Cedar Mountain battlefield. So it's just one more way that all these sites can come together and we can make a difference. Thanks again.